welcome to the office hours. It is July 19th. I hope that is correct. Sometimes I'm a little bit off of time. This session is recorded, so audio, video, it's all recorded. If you don't want to show up on camera, feel free to keep mic and camera off. Otherwise, we have your total permission to put this on YouTube afterwards. All right. So I'm Chris. I think there is, well, I'm not sure about Sam. Maybe there's somebody new here. I'm one of the developer advocates, and I have quite a few colleagues here. Interestingly enough, my co-colleague, who's normally running the, or co-host is not here. He is in vacation. I don't think he deserves that, but well, it is what it is, right? But I have two other colleagues, Mathis and Kirk, and I have one other colleague for a very special session today. So Brian, we'll come to you in a few seconds. And for today, a very small agenda. There was one minor or patch release, so nothing super fancy. Then we have the special QA towards the toolkit and the general QA that we always have. The release 2.11.1, so in case if you're on 2.11, you may want to update actually. For people that are not on 2.11 yet, we added support for delete and update on compressed chunks. I think that is the now longest standing and most wished feature. So 2.11 is good, but you should totally update to 2.11.1. There's a few smaller bug fixes. You really don't want to you really don't want to hit the bugs. But that is it. 2.12 is not yet out. I'm not sure if there is any release date already, so I don't know. Two quick thanks, Jamie D9 and however you're gonna pronounce that, 𝗥𝗲𝗃𝗃𝗀𝗃𝗃, whatever. They helped us out with some of the bug fixes, reported them. So if you find anything and you know how to reproduce it, please open an issue in GitHub. It is so helpful, and it speeds up the process so much with bug fixes. But with that, we are already up for the questions towards the toolkit. And I can unshare my screen so we keep it a little bit more informal. And I think, Daniel, you sent in a few questions, right?
Yeah, I wrote a couple of questions on the forum, I guess you call it. Mm-hmm.
You want me to read them out, or do you want to ask yourself?
No, I can go ahead and ask myself. I'll just have to find them. Just a sec.
I can send you the link.
No, I got the link here. That's
all right.
Fine. Yeah, so I guess it's Brian, right? You're the toolkit developer, yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess the question is kind of focused towards you. So I've been fiddling around a bit with uddsketch to get percentile approximation. And it's a neat function, but it also has a few, to me, unintuitive flavors to it when it comes to how you interpret these max error parameter, for example, and how it behaves towards, I mean, the distribution of the input data and so on. And then you add roll up to this in your CAGs, and then everything gets even more confusing to me sometimes. So basically on a general level, I guess, I mean, it would be nice to have some best practices around uddsketch and percentile approximations in general. Any kind of do's and don'ts about it, what kind of data does it really fit to be used upon, and which data doesn't it fit to be used on, and some gotchas and things around that. So without going into more details about it, maybe you could just give some pointers on how to use it and so on.
Yeah, we can certainly do that. And yeah, first of all, apologies for the max error parameter. That is the worst named parameter ever, and it's completely unintuitive. I was pulling for initial relative error bounds, but people decided that was a little too verbose. I think we more ended up with max error just because we couldn't come up with something that was better. But so I guess at a high level, we tried to put in this percentile egg that people can use in place of uddsketch that should work for a lot of use cases. And what the percentile egg is it's really just an alias for uddsketch with 200 buckets and 0.001 max error. In terms of what these parameters actually are and how they do, let me actually go a little into how uddsketch works. So under the hood, uddsketch is really just a exponential, or it's a histogram with exponential sized buckets. Basically, every bucket will have some reference value such that the lower bound is some, if you take the reference value over the lower bound, it will be 1 plus some alpha, and the upper bound will be, or reference value over the upper bound would be 1 minus that alpha. So the idea is everything within this bucket falls within some alpha, which is a relative error of this reference value. And that's the neat thing about uddsketch is it basically guarantees this for anything that falls within this bucket. If you're looking for a particular percentile, and we know that the index of the percentile falls within this bucket, we can tell you that, okay, this value is going to be within this error bound of that. But the other nice thing about uddsketch is once you find you're tracking too many bits of data, you can actually combine the adjacent buckets and essentially take a new reference value somewhere towards the middle of them, and then you have a new error, which is not quite double the previous one because it's an exponential scale, so it's almost double, but not quite. So when you create a uddsketch, you give us the maximum number of buckets you're willing to have, which is purely how big you're willing to let your structure grow. And it's going to be some 16-ish bytes per element plus some overhead. So you can basically think how many of these things you're going to have. You're going to have like hourly UDD sketches. You might, the 200 elements might be fine. If you're collecting UDD sketch for an entire week's worth of data, you might want to have 1,000, 5,000 buckets maybe. And then the max error, all this is it's the initial alpha that we create the very first sketch with. And honestly, it's something that you shouldn't worry too much when you're creating. You should use a value that's going to be smaller than you need, and then just let the sketch combine as it needs to as you push data into it. And I wouldn't go with anything too terribly small, but even if you did something like 10 to the negative 20th as your error bounds, you're just going to do maybe 60 compactions before you start getting it into a useful state. And yeah,
so could I just I have kind of a practical example there just to follow up with a question. So for example, in my case, I have let's say I'm measuring well, my metric is kind of varying. So sometimes it's basically 0. Maybe it's always positive, but it's let's say between 0 and 1 for some moments in time. And then suddenly it can go up for a few hours, let's say to 100. So, but basically it's only the offset of the data that changes. So the distribution of the data is basically the same. So sometimes it varies between 0 and 1 in a kind of noisy way. And sometimes it varies between 99 and 100, let's say. And what I've seen, I think, is that when I apply this max error, when I apply uddsketch on these different kinds of segments of data, then the number of bins that are actually being used is very different. So if you're getting closer to 1, But I guess this is because of the logarithmic binning and these exponential things.
Yeah, this is, and what does it guarantees a relative error. So
yeah, so I guess your suggestion is to kind of decrease the max error parameter to a very low level to kind of force uddsketch to use basically all the bins, never mind the input data distribution.
So UDD will, yeah, I mean, I guess transfer that with a low enough level that most of your distinct values go into their own bin, then it will start to combine them. If you have both of these data in one uddsketch, it's going to be a problem though, because you're going to find that the binning that it needs to correctly get the data in between 0 and 1 is going to just put all of your data between 99 and 100 into one bin.
Right. Yeah, that's of course correct. So even if you end up with them being in different sketches, when you apply rollup,
Yeah,
to in your hierarchical CAG or whatever, then it will in a way not work really well, I guess.
right. And that's, yeah, the relative errors are going to be so much lower in the 0 to 1 case than they are in the 99 to 100 case.
Right. Okay. So maybe if I interpret this correctly, maybe this use case, when you have data that is kind of quite dynamic in its nature, then maybe uddsketch is really not the way to go to get your percentile approximations in the end.
If the magnitudes are such that you're dealing with I mean, if this was something where it was like 99 to 100 and then, 999 to 1,000, it would be much better. The fact that 0 to 1 is such a zoomed in range there that it's going to, with a very, it's going to compact very aggressively for those values.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Okay. Would it be possible in this case to say everything below, I don't know, like 2 or something goes into another uddsketch, and when you query, you actually combine those, because you're looking at the percentiles, right? So you could probably merge them together while querying.
Yeah, I guess I could do that. You're addressing me, I guess, Chris. If I could do, I mean, kind of filter data and separate the outputs into different sketches. Yeah, I guess that could be a kind of a workaround to handle the dynamics of the data in a sense. Yeah.
One thing that might also work, and this is completely hacky, is if when you're pushing data into this, you simply add 1,000 plus your value, and then when you get your result back, subtract the actual result. So
you're increasing the size. Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty good idea, man. I mean, then
you would have to multiply it, right? If you do an addition, you will have the same issue again. You will be between 1,000 and 1,001. So you have to multiply it out.
Well, I think it's the other way around, right? If you multiply it, you won't get rid of the dynamics of the data. So I guess you need to add an offset to the data, and then if I understand correctly, and then you subtract this offset when you extract the percentiles later on.
But when you add the offset, you'll end up in the same bucket again, right?
So if you're trying to say you have let me just think.
I'm not a math genius. I might be completely wrong here. I'm actually really bad at math.
So what we're looking at, so the buckets are sized such that they have some relative range, and these are, the smallest bucket is going to be the one adjacent to 1. Actually, I guess they get smaller going down towards 0, but you end up with very, very tiny buckets down in the 0 to 1 range. Because if you want to find something that's 1% away from, say, 0.1, that could take you from like what, 0.091 to 0.11. But the same 1% difference from 100 is going to cover the entire 99 to 101 point something range. So
Right.
so if you add 1,000 to everything, then your buckets will be about the same for both of these ranges.
Yeah, right.
But that's a couple of interesting ideas, and I will try to pursue them when my vacation, I guess, ends. So thanks for that.
I think you also had a second one, didn't you?
Yeah, I mean it's related in the sense that it's also about distributions of the data. So, and I noticed that there is an histogram function. So if my kind of distribution of the data, which is basically my use case, is if it's known beforehand, I can define the bins beforehand and use that information, and don't fall into these kind of traps with uddsketch where it really works for all kinds of data you put in. I can handle those kind of corner cases myself. So the question is there a way to use histogram in your CAGs and your rollups, and how would you go about deriving the percentile approximations when you have the histograms, if it's possible?
Right. So, yeah, histogram it's actually a weird function. It's one of these ones that predates the toolkit, so it's kind of falls into this realm of hyperfunctions that's not quite as well supported and isn't as thought out as some of the other things we have. And here you really have to know the I mean, you'll have the same issue if you have two ranges of numbers. Your histogram will have to somehow deal with those as well. But in terms of how you would, I guess there's two questions here: how you get the percentile approximation out of this, and then how you would do a roll-up of this. The roll-up is unfortunately not, there's nothing that we have that makes this easy, but this is essentially it's just, the result of this is just an array. So if you're generating the same array over two different sets of data, all you really want to do is essentially sum the values by index, which you can do without too much difficulty. You're going to end up doing if you do an unnest with ordinality, and then you can sum group by ordinality, would actually do this, and then do an array egg on the result of that to get it back into an array. So it's doable, it's just a little convoluted.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
In terms of how you would then get the percentile egg, it's basically kind of the same thing that uddsketch does under the hood. You figure out how many total data points you have, and then figure out what the index you're looking for your percentile is. So if you have, 1,000 data points and you're looking for the 90th percentile, you'll be like, okay, I want to find data index 101. So you basically start at your lowest bucket and then just step through subtracting the number of elements in each bucket from the index you're looking for until you find the bucket that contains that, and then basically your approximation is it's somewhere within that bucket.
Yeah. Understood. Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks for the answers to my questions. Really appreciate it.
All right. We have a few more people. Anyone else having some hyperfunction toolkit questions? If you don't want to talk, you can also always write it to the chat. I'm happy to read it out loud for you. Seems like you're getting off the hook really quick.
I do have a follow-up question actually, but it's maybe this is more on a Postgres level and pretty basic. I'm far from an expert when it comes to these things. But is there a way to? I've noticed that the sketch object or the uddsketch object that is a result of the uddsketch function, it's not a JSON object, but it's kind of it's a key value thing in a sense. Is there a way to extract those values from the uddsketch object, or are you kind of forced to use the functions already at hand to extract part of it.
All right, so the actual how we store this is it's actually you're right, it's not JSON, it's this Rust object notation crate that we've used to which we were using JSON for this originally, but JSON doesn't necessarily, its numbers don't correspond nicely to most languages floats. So we were having a hard time with JSON, that there's no real way to represent infinite value, negative infinite. Basically, just the weird float values don't translate well into JSON, so we use this RON instead. And there really isn't an easy way to get the data out of this without using the functions. You can, I guess, you can kind of look at it, figure out what things are, and parse them out yourself, but we don't actually provide an easy way of doing that. It's actually a little interesting. You can kind of create your own string that's supposed to be one of these objects, try and cast it into a uddsketch and run our functions on it, and very likely blow things up terribly because we don't do a validation that this is properly formatted and or I shouldn't say not properly formatted, but basically we don't verify that these things are like in the correct order, and you might end up with very odd values coming out of it.
All right, yeah, fair enough, yeah.
That being said, we actually sometimes do, actually I'm working with our console team now, and we're working on this query stats and creating an intermediate step where they actually build up a intermediate uddsketch using a Python. Actually, it's, I guess, written in Golang. And they do this because they have so much data that's so expensive to actually run their continuous egg on the raw data. That they find that if they pre-process and generate their own uddsketch using intermediate data, they can actually keep up with the incoming data.
So I think they keep the state in their Golang application and write the uddsketch to database, or
yeah, they keep the state there and figure out what the corresponding. I actually worked with them, and we went through, and it uses the exact same code. We just ported it to the Golang.
Right.
But yeah, it's very hacky, and it kind of keeps me awake at night in terms of.
You said two things which are very common. You don't have to be sorry for naming things really badly, because we've all been there. And the other thing, it's hacky. I mean, isn't that what our job is anyways? Maybe I'll drop in a question from the community. Nothing that was specifically asked, but just because the question comes up quite a few times. We have the "don't hit me if I'm wrong" state ACK, where it could say, hey, button is pressed or window is open, window is closed, and then you can calculate the time between those. Like a window was open for like 20 minutes. One question that comes up over and over again, you have to calculate that over multiple buckets or time buckets in the worst case, and that is where people often fall over. And since we're putting this to YouTube, maybe we get a good answer, because I really have a hard time with that as well, but I can point people to that.
Right. And yeah, this problem is, of course, we have a window where we have like, okay, we know that we have a
I think the problem is that you don't really have a start state at the beginning of the time bucket.
That's exactly the problem. We have some data for this, say, day, where it's like, okay, button pressed, button lifted, button pressed, button lifted. Problem is we have a period of time before our first event where we don't know what the state of the button was then. And I guess, yeah, at the end of the day, we'll know that. And we do have this notion of interpolated state, where we can actually if you have a bunch of days worth of data and I want to figure out, okay, for this day, what was what portion of the day was the button down? There was an interpolated version of this where I can pass in the previous day as well, so it can look at the last state of that and then figure out what the starting state was and
All right.
use that. There are still some wonky corner cases here. In particular, if we have this aggregate where we have the state egg for each day, but we have a day where there were no events. Things kind of go off the rails there, even in terms of trying to figure out what the interpolated values are.
Right. So you have to figure out where was the last value, or where was the last value, or the last state change.
Right.
Interpolated duration. Okay, fair enough. There you go. I'll learn something. Happens a lot. I think Sam wrote something. Real-time materialized view without aggregation. Okay, I think that is not specifically for you. So if there is no other question, I think you're off the hook, and we're going over to the general Q&A. Feel free to stay and give your own ideas and feelings and thoughts and whatever.
Go back
So,
into
so Sam, you want to really quickly summarize the issue? I'm looking at it, but I think Jonathan's looked at that.
Hey, yeah, I can summarize. So yeah, I basically am hoping to take real-time streaming data, which I'm storing in a hypertable, and I just want to create really a view of that data with swapping around columns, but I still want it to be truly refreshed and as close to real time as possible. So I looked at continuous and real-time aggregates, but since I don't actually want to aggregate, I just wanted to check if I should stick with materialized views with my own triggers, or if there are any other options that I should look at.
So what does it mean when you say you want to flip around columns? I see from what I see in the forum, it's basically a conversion between the different table formats, table layouts.
Yeah, exactly. Like a medium table, for instance, where all the columns are different data types. And then I want to create, for instance, a view where now I can create a bunch of narrow tables, for instance, where instead of data types, it's the actual like measurement or variable names as columns instead of data types.
So you want to do the opposite of pivoting, right? No, you want multiple narrow tables.
Yes, that I can like pick and choose which which names within a given column are used to generate a narrow table.
Right. I think you could probably do this with a magic function and a view, and the view is basically just using the function with different parameters.
Would that be a materialized view?
No, a standard view. Well, you could probably do it with materialized view, but you would have the issue that it's all or nothing refresh, right?
Oh, I see. But continuous aggregates is doing this in real time as well, right? With materialized views.
Right, but in this case, you have to do some aggregation. So you have to have like a time bucket or a time bucket gap fill. One thing, and I mean, we already had hacky things, so I'm coming up with my own hacky solution. One thing we did in the past was we made the time bucket so small that it basically was equal to the raw data, which means you're not actually aggregating, you're getting the raw timestamps again. But you can use a continuous aggregate. It's a very hacky solution.
But in practice, has that been shown to work without a?
I don't know if they ever put it into production, but I know at least one or two use cases where people at least tried it.
Okay, sounds good. And just a quick follow up on that is if I have columns which can't be aggregated, like large binary type or text, for instance. Do you know how to handle that? Are there any good advice for how to not aggregate those columns?
Perk, any idea on that? You probably have to build your own, like, you're muted, or something, or your computer at least. I think you could write your own aggregation that doesn't do anything, basically taking the value and giving it out.
Wow. I think if it is in a hypertable, I don't think that there's any way to avoid aggregation.
But you could, I mean, if your time bucket only has one value, you could write an aggregation that takes the value and hands it out again, basically not doing.
Right. Make a bucket of, a
First.
you
Oh
know,
yeah, right. If your bucket only has one value, you can use first or last. Yeah, good point. There you go.
I know that's pretty hacky, but wow.
As I said, it's what we do as developers. We write hacky things. I see Kirk isn't he's not convinced.
I'm having issues over here.
Fair.
But I don't the only way to do that would be to make a 1-for-1 table and make it not make it not a hypertable, so that you could.
Yeah, but I think from yeah, I think the alternative using triggers and doing that is probably way more overhead than just doing it the kind of hacky way, right?
I don't know. Yeah, I'm not sure how to get there unless the data was already in that form coming in.
Yeah, the alternative that Jonathan has put out is that I'm actually working on like an event streaming tool that you can it basically captures the events from the hypertable, like inserts, updates, and stuff. You could use that, transform it, and write it back to the database. But it's I don't know. It feels as hacky because now you're also multiplying the insert operations. Basically the same thing as with the trigger, except for you don't have the trigger overhead on the insert.
Right.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, not sure. You could totally use it. I mean, if you have anything like a data pipeline like Flink or anything in place, that could totally be a way. An alternative that I haven't tried. It could be something like CDC and something like Materialize behind that, but I don't know. Never tried it.
Got it. Yeah, sounds good. Thanks.
All right. It was another message. Oh no, that was what about first? Okay. Anyone else? Something? Marco, Bonnie, Bonnie, but hello, Remington, hello. More people joined. Any other questions? And again, if you don't want to speak up, feel free to write it. I'm happy to read it out loud for you.
I have one more question.
Yeah, sure.
Is anyone very familiar with the Helm charts for Timescale?
Kind of. It's a complicated topic.
Yeah.
Or I guess a general question is, so the charts for Timescale is using Timescale version 2.9 by default, I believe. And it got me thinking, now if I want to go and upgrade from Timescale 2.9 to 2.12 when it comes out, are there good recommendations for how I should handle that database migration, or any tools that are baked into, Kubernetes deployments or Helm or anything?
So from Kubernetes, you don't really have anything to do other than changing the image. New images always contain, I don't know, a bunch of old versions, because when you upgrade, the database will start with the old version, and then you do the standard upgrade procedure with create extension, update, whatever. And that is when the actual extension is updated. So it's pretty much the same thing, except for you have to update or change the image beforehand and restart the container. That's it. Nothing magic happening.
Oh, I see. But on the, I guess to actually do the Postgres update if necessary, and then to do the actual timescale update, I guess, will the timescale update require a database migration?
Normally it won't. As long as the Postgres version is supported, that's all fine.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Anything else? Otherwise, we'll do a quick one today, and I'll let you guys back to breakfast, beer, dinner, whatever.
I have a really newbie question. If you guys are up for it.
Yeah.
All right. Query planners. OpenAI's beautiful GPT 3.5 Turbo API endpoint thinks that Timescale's query planner is special, but Timescale's website and docs don't make any mention of that except for in the I think it's distributed hypertables section. Anyway, I'm not a Postgres guy, I'm not a database guy. Can somebody just like give me a real basic architectural concept map of how different is our query planner from Postgres's query planner? And like, I don't know, whatever I don't know about that. Like, I don't know much about those. I'm assuming it makes a difference with performance of queries, but it never comes up in performance conversations. It's only hypertables, continuous aggregates, compression, and those things, which I get. But then the query planner seems like that's where the magic would be happening.
So the TLDR it's the same query planner. Timescale only has a few hooks, like, hey, for that specific like database object, like a hypertable, please call back to us so we tell you what tables are necessary. I think for the long answer, Kirk would be the one.
Yeah, I could. Yeah, Chris is fundamentally right. The query planner does not change. But the Postgres query planner is extensible, right? So welcome to the wonderful world of PostgreSQL extensions. And this is why, so you can add your own functions to the table of the pgproc table and have the query planner call your functions and tell it what the costs and everything of that is. And then the query planner, the existing query planner just sucks up your additional functionality as if it was part of the regular Postgres thing. And in fact, that's how a lot of Postgres itself is implemented. Tons of Postgres is just additional functions in pgproc. There's a bunch of it that actually doesn't even map to a C function. It maps to a PLPG SQL function. And so we make use of that by extending it the way it's designed to be extended. But from a heuristic point of view, something pointing from the front end inward can just use any old libpq client. Anything that supports libpq supports Postgres, which supports us. So there's nothing special about the protocol. There's nothing special about the data marshaling. There's nothing special about the query planner itself. At the end of the day, it really comes down to just additional functions.
Yeah, and so like from a very naive perspective, if I were going to implement something partitioning wise with pgpartman, would pgpartman be doing adding their own similar functions to the query planner so that can use those as well? Or would I have to redo a bunch of sort of optimizations myself?
pgpartman uses Postgres's built-in partitioning, not and you can use declarative partitioning, or you can use Postgres's original, function-driven stuff. So it's a little bit of an orthogonal question because pgpartman doesn't do hypertables, and Postgres's partitioning is not equal to Timescale's partitioning, even though we use the same words because it means we're taking one table and dividing it up into chunks. But so at a very 10,000 foot view, it's kind of the same idea. but at a practical level, there's no overlap.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to get at, is that specific thing. I don't see a lot of the distinction between, I see a lot of the simplification of a hypertable is essentially, a bunch of child tables in the background that act as a single table in the front. But when it comes to making the case for TimescaleDB versus other solutions, then that's when it's like, well, you could just use pgpartman, which obviously that's not the same, and there's a lot of manual work that's involved there, and you have to obviously create a lot of triggers and bugs, but that's what I'm trying to understand more.
So one thing that pgpartman solves for you is the creation of partitions, right? You can use declarative partitioning without pgpartman, but you would have to create the partitions, and you have to make sure you have the partition when it's necessary. One of the things that it doesn't do, it uses triggers, and triggers have a lot of overhead. So what happens is it will hook into the actual query implementation as a trigger, at least as far as I know, and see, oh, there is a timestamp where I don't have a partition yet, so it will create the partition. While the general concept is similar to what Timescale does, Timescale does it in a hook, so we don't have the query of the trigger overhead, because we get informed by the query planner, hey, this is what we insert, what we want to insert, and we know it right away, and we actually use the internal C API to make all of that happen before the query is actually implemented. Which is funny because there is a trigger on a hypertable, and I've been asked in the past, like, what is the overhead of that? It's literally 0, because it's never going to be executed as long as the extension is loaded correctly.
And there's a big difference on the storage side of our thing too, because a regular partition is partitioned by some key in the data. It's customer ID or something like that. Our partitioning turns the table into a column data store, and that column. So under the hood are what we're partitioning by and how we're storing the data is very different.
And I'm not sure if you could use declarative partitioning and partman with secondary dimensions. I think they only have like one dimension.
They only have one dimension. Now you can have a composite key and call that one dimension, but
yeah, okay, fair enough.
But from partman's point of view, it's still only one dimension. So we have 2 dimensions of partitioning. There's otherwise there's only one. And our actual storage is column data store, and it's based on columns, not on keys. So there's a different animal behind it. And the way the data is accessed is also therefore different, depending on the storage.
It's interesting, and it asks lots of questions, but also answers lots of questions. So thank you.
Right. Yeah.
That's very helpful.
I just kicked off like Timescale 101, which is, at that point you can ask all of the questions.
All right, Sam had another quick question. At what number of rows should I split one hypertable into multiple ones? I think that is the gist of it. And that is, to be honest, I think it's not easily answerable, because you could have like 1 billion rows over 10 years, or you could have 1 billion rows over 10 minutes. The latter case is probably the one where you want to split.
It's really more of a matter of what is your ingestion and what is your read rate, right? So it's more about a verb than a noun. So if you can support the activity, it doesn't matter how many rows there are. If you can't support the activity, that's too many rows. So it's a little bit hard to do it in terms of, how do I measure that by the noun on disk?
There are small differences, especially with one hypertable or multiple ones. It depends a little bit on the use case and the queries. Let me find the blog post. I actually wrote a blog post about that a while ago. And one of the points that I was making is, when you store data for multiple customers, you may want to have one hypertable per customer in case you get a request for the customer to be completely deleted. because in this case, it's easy. You just drop the hypertable and say, okay, I'm done. But what it brings is quite a bit more management overhead, because now you need to make sure that all the tables are actually in sync, and the data schema and the schema matches and all that kind of stuff. Otherwise, you'll end up with a bit of well, I don't want to say joy, but at least surprise when you try to insert and the data model doesn't match anymore. But maybe that blog post helps a little bit in trying to figure out when you actually want to go for multiple hypertables and not. Normally, it doesn't necessarily depend on the number of rows. It's more other use cases surrounding the data storage and data model and how you handle customers and stuff.
Thanks. Yeah, sounds good. And just to check, is it basically like you just have to do a heap search to find the right hypertable chunk? So number of rows will scale the amount of time it takes to find the right like chunk in the hypertable?
No, I don't think so.
Well, because
So the way it works is that we basically just, well, we probably do a heap search based on the timestamp and see what chunk matches that time frame. I mean, the only thing we do is like larger or greater than and lower than, or lower, whatever. But obviously we're walking through the chunks. However, I think we're actually running a query against Postgres. So whatever Postgres does is what we do. But with a big number of partitions or chunks, depending on your query, you could end up with a lot of chunks in the query plan, and that is where you really get hit. I've seen queries with like 100 chunks, and that is where the query planner has so many permutation options to build up the query plan that you see the query the planning time going up exponentially. So you want to make sure that your chunk size is something that makes sense. So you maybe stay in like the 20-ish or below 20 chunks when you query something, or okay, I'm doing like a long running operation like a report. It can run overnight. I don't care how long this operation takes. But for anything that should be fast, you want to keep the number of partitions fairly low. And I don't know. I think the search in itself often is not the Kirk is changing color, pictures. I think the search for the necessary chunk is not the thing that really takes long. It's normally when you have a lot of chunks, you see that the planning time goes up quite extensively.
Okay, thanks. Sounds good.
All right. Any last questions? We have 8 minutes to go. Otherwise, 3, 2, 1. Okay, no famous last words. All right, then I'll do the famous last words. All right. Thanks for joining. We have the office hours very regularly every third Wednesday, midday ET. So it's 6 p.m. German time. Feel free to send in questions via Slack or the forum. And the next one will be August 16th. So I'm looking forward to seeing everyone again. Thank you very much for joining.